My talk's on 2012 and the wide variety of ideas around what's going to happen at this significant date. To give you a little bit of background, I'm an historian of magic and of the emotions, because the one or the other wasn't, niche enough. So, we can talk about the history and the ideas, but I know very well that the majority of you are here desperately seeking answers from me, obviously, and so I thought I'd just launch straight into what's going to happen, and then we can pick it apart later, yeah?
Yeah.
Bear in mind, I've checked with sources, both terrestrial and otherwise. Yeah, with hands. The sky will blind radiant and quake and part and come loose from its moorings. The seas will boil and freeze. Mountains groan and heave and swell to disgorge avalanches, wrapped in tornadoes, wrapped in mega tsunamis. The sunspots go thermonuclear and the ice caps sublimate to acid rain and new cars melt. Magnetic poles shift and the planet spins into perfect alignment with 62 of Jupiter's moons, Sirius, Zeta Reticuli, Tau Ceti, the Hale-Bopp comet, and an ancient unnameable constellation suspended in a trans-dimensional anomaly, obviously. Omnidirectional wormholes thoroughly moth-pot the fourth wall. Electromagnetism forgets itself and physics throws a wobbly. Nibiru crashes into the Antarctic, the moon splits like a chalky amoeba, werewolves hold a press conference, headlines rearrange themselves into the Book of Revelations, Scientologists spontaneously combust, the octopuses finally recognise human intelligence, the Anunnaki beam down in Guy Fawkes masks to snatch our children and mainline their sweet fear hormones. The policemen are so young they mind taking a photo like using a camera phone. The Large Hadron Collider is simultaneously hit by Iranian warheads and a stray meteorite, catalysing the gamma-ray burst that signals the end of human fertility. Learning computers render scientists redundant as robots design better robots, and self-replicating nanotech runs amok, converting all organic matter to diamond. Andromeda collides with the Milky Way, the resultant solar flares mutate resistant strains of HIV into an ultra-contagious pandemic, greenhouse feedback triggers Gulf Stream shut down as a clusterfuck of peak oil, overpopulation and water shortage takes care of the Northern Hemisphere, a good old-fashioned famine finishes off the stragglers, and the Bank of England issues a special extinction event commemorative coin in an extremely limited release run. The bees return, dolphins leave, dogs and cats marry, divorce and remarry. Jesus vomits live scorpion heads and sulphur. The omega point trips all the dormant DMT in each and every Homo sapien brain. Time travellers turn up with holographic Polaroids of your face the moment it happened. The supermassive black hole at the centre of the universe prolapses. Everything explodes and implodes at exactly the same instant, which, time itself having long also exploded, imploded, lasts all of eternity, as well as being outside of, parallel to, and or in nodding acquaintance with linear temporality. Anyway, we all grow an extra thumb and become telepathic and never forget anyone's birthday again and get raptured up and consumed in hellfire and experience every memory ever, all at once. Or something. So, now we know. And you can join my cult later. I've set up a PayPal account and everything. From a point of view of modern Western secular rationality, there appears no reason why a date in 2012 should be any more inherently significant than the preceding or following years. Yet, here we are, living at a time and in a culture in which there are a plethora of theories and explanations insisting 2012 will indeed herald a global event or change of some kind. These theories range from ideas of prophecy, millenarianism and the apocalypse to calendars, conspiracies, and the harmonic resonance of the universe. Some of these theories have intricately, some of these theorists, have intricately codified their ideas. For some, it's more akin to a sort of general feeling than a systemized body of eschatology. Some cite their sources as channeled transmissions from intelligent non-human entities, such as God or the denizens of Zeta Reticuli. The theories that make up the 2012 corpus span all the way from the horrific Armageddon to the emergence of an holistic global consciousness of peace, harmony and spirituality. Whether cataclysmic or utopian, we are discussing thinking about and acting in a universe in which forces not recognised by modern scientific paradigms are posited to be in operation. A metaphysical or magical universe. The questions then become, what precedent ideas and assumptions might these 2012 discourses be related to? How have our ancestors considered a magical universe? And finally, what comparison can be made between the apocalyptic thinkers of today and of the past? The early modern period, which runs from about 1500 to about 1700, 1750, depending on the historian you ask, marks a particularly pertinent and fertile field for inquiries of this kind, particularly 17th century England. This is a tumultuous period in which a civil war was fought, regicide revoked the divine right of kings, a commonwealth was installed, eventually went into crisis, and monarchy was slipped in the back door again. The intellectual and cultural turbulence accompanying these political and social upheavals fermented radical ideas, especially when we bear in mind the restrictions and censorship imposed upon printing presses were almost completely lifted in England between 1640 and 1660, meaning these radical ideas could be disseminated to a wider reading audience than ever before. I have a friend, Richard Sandling, who runs a VHS shop, an actual old VHS tape shop in Essex, and goes up to the Edinburgh Fringe every year, insisting that, doing a show, insisting that VHS is better than DVD. And he claims that the last time that England had the amount that there was an amount of freedom for press and for the distribution of ideas was in the video nasty period. So we had a lot to talk about when we compared video nasty to cosmologically nasty. These ideas included theories of eschatology and millenarianism that are comparable in a number of ways to those of the 2012 corpus, which is just as well, so otherwise I'd have very little to talk about. So, what parallels can be drawn between modern occult narratives focusing on 2012 and those of the early modern period? In order to investigate these questions, I've drawn out three basic threads of ideological commonality from the various theories that afford 2012 some kind of special significance. I'd also like to note that I've deliberately paid special attention to those more fringe ideas, the less orthodox theories of the early modern period. I will not, for example, be covering the more established ideas of the church, state, or other contemporary authorities. I don't think even the most hardcore of 2012 theorists would deny that they occupied an ideological position that could be, accurately described, at least in relation to most scientists and academics, as radical. The root itself obviously being radix or root. For this reason, my intentions with this talk are to provide a comparative show and tell of radical, early modern and modern perspectives on time, history and the nature of the cosmos. Hopefully our understanding of both sets of ideas can be at least a little advanced by this kind of cross-cultural analysis. So the first thing I want to talk about is the appeal to ancient knowledge. As an idea you will be very, very familiar with. You just might not have heard it put like that. The first and perhaps most obvious commonality between the majority of 2012 narratives, beyond the year itself, is an appeal to some kind of ancient knowledge. This occurs most obviously within ideas directly related to the Mayan long calendar and other calendrical extrapolations. Indeed, a cursory search on the internet reveals a preoccupation with the Mayans to be present in the vast majority of books on the 2012 phenomenon corpus. I'm desperately trying to keep on tongue the notion that 2012 isn't one idea. There are a vast number of really, really different, some of them completely contradictory ideas coming out of all sorts of people. So I'm kind of calling it the 2012 corpus, sort of milieu of these ideas. The appeal to forms of ancient wisdom can also be located in Terence McKenna's use of the I Ching, and specifically the King Wen sequence of the hexagrams, as well as Mayan calendrical mathematics, in formulating his famous time wave zero theory. This theory underpins a time wave fractal graph, which proposes two interesting features about the nature of time. Firstly, the graph supposedly demonstrates the underlying fluxing pattern of novelty or interconnectedness of events across time. Secondly, the time wave theory posits that time itself is accelerating towards a teleological attractor at the end of history, envisioned as what he called an omega point, or a singularity of infinite interrelation, which is exponentially pulling everything towards itself. This time wave graph models the nature and operation of time, and as such can be utilised as both a historiographical and eschatological tool. However, more immediately pertinent to the current point is the fact that this fractal graph was formulated using a data set taken from the sequence of broken and unbroken lines of the hexagrams of the I Ching as arranged in the King Wen order. Whatever the source material, the shared premise of 2012 narratives seems to be that ancient thinkers understood things that we have forgotten and characterised processes of the universe's nature and operation with accurate and useful ontological taxonomies and epistemological systems. This appeal to the authority of traditional or forgotten knowledge to justify magical ideas actually seems somewhat logical from a modern perspective. It makes sense for us to look to the accepted truths and forgotten perspectives of so-called pre-scientific cultures when one is advocating ideas about a 2012 phenomenon that modern scientific communities are at the very least ignoring, if not flat-out rejecting. Recourse to supposedly ancient knowledge has a rich lineage within the history of magical thinking itself. The attributions of various medieval grimoires detailing the evocation of demons to authors such as King Solomon and Moses are prime examples of this. Occult philosophers on the medieval and particularly early modern periods utilised a variety of ancient lore, often combining radically different cultural and intellectual theories and structures, bits of Jewish Kabbalah and Arabic alchemy, Babylonian and Greek astrology, etc. This eventually births the peculiar syncretic Hermeticism of the Renaissance, which people like Dame Frances Yates, who also writes on the Rosicrucians, have said formed a key driving aspect of the humanism that inspires people in the Renaissance to move away from both accepted Christian church dogma and Aristotelian scholasticism, and actually examine nature, far from don't open the packet, don't see how it works, gets replaced by the notion that we've been given brains and fingers and tongues to try and understand the universe. While occurring within a radically different historical context, such combinations of different cultural artefacts to produce occult philosophy, especially eschatology, is somewhat reminiscent of McKenna's revision of his November 2012 date for the eschaton, which is the original time-wave fractal projection for when it'll all kick off, derived from numerological study of the Chinese Book of Changes to fit with other versions of the end of the Mayan Baktun 13 cycle. To be clear, we're not just talking about people of the past conducting their own historical research in order to reconstruct older worldviews or challenge dominant paradigms, although certainly that occurred, but the conflation of various forms of law and ways of knowing into a unified mythic wisdom of the ancients, upon which the accuracy and even legitimacy of their own contemporary magical thinking could be based. That is, wisdom with a capital W and ancients with a capital A. Hence, one of the most famous occult philosophers of the early modern and medieval period, really, is hence Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's declaration at the beginning of his momentous 3 books of occult philosophy that, quote, natural magic was by the ancients, again capitalised, esteemed as the highest and most sacred philosophy. This homogenisation of different sources and cultures into a unified wisdom of the ancients can be observed most clearly in the notion of the Prisca Theologia, which is an idea popular with early modern thinkers such as Giordano Bruno, Matteo Ficino, Campanella, and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who are all astronomers, astrologers, alchemists, magicians, and perhaps somewhat ill-fitting, been taken up by the new movement of scientism, this kind of Dawkins-esque reliance upon a particular version of ontology as the definite truth of the universe. The most obvious appeal to divine messages and ancient wisdom within early modern Europe was, of course, Scriptural. The power of an ancient text expounding a particular spiritual view of the universe, such as the Bible or the I Ching, as opposed to knowledge systems focusing on, say, calendrical techniques, should be clear. Not only are these kinds of texts quite old, but on top of their divine providence, they offer a very real sense of insider information on those big metaphysical and existential questions. We'll return later to discuss how biblical symbolism was utilised in the early modern period in some very specific ways to analyse history and the course of human destiny, which bear some striking resemblances to what's being done with 2012 now. Early modern thinkers also found the divine in the very codifications used by ancient cultures. Not only was the message sacred, but the medium too. Not just what was said, but how it was transmitted. Alphabets were a prime example of this. despite also detailing techniques for Roman, Greek and English alphabets that allotted systematically numerical values to letters in order to play maths games with the spelling and meaning of words, Agrippa declared the greatest mysteries lie in Hebrew letters. Have anyone seen Darren Aronofsky movie Pi? That's all. The process the Hasidic guy talks about there, where you can take the values of you can take the numbers attributed to letters, add them up, and then play games with them. So the numerical value of sum of the value of the letters in father and the letters in mother add up to the numerical value of the letters for child, for example. These are things that these are forms of exegesis of biblical texts that people have been doing for a very, very long time. Similarly, Agrippa considered that the Theban alphabet, so called because it was delivered by Honorius of Thebes, as that which the ancients called hieroglyphical, or sacred letters, because devoted to the secrets of the gods. A final common component of this appeal to ancient wisdom is that it should be to exotic ancient wisdom. This is crucial. This kind of appeal comes in the form of early modern European conceptions of the exotic and supposedly learned Chaldeans, for example, who were basically the Mesopotamians, who were credited as having, amongst other things, codified the proper magical sequence of the classical planets, the imaginatively titled Chaldean order, from heavy Saturn all the way down to the Alacritous moon. And in the esotericism of those modern proponents of some link between 2012 and Atlantis, yes, that's Atlantis, which itself also fits very neatly with the idea of lost and inevitably rediscovered wisdom. It was observed by Agrippa that many codifiers of the Western esoteric traditions, that ancient wisdom is received from the many prelates among diverse nations and sects of religions, whose institutions came not to us by reason that few of them were delivered by the authors scatteringly and by fragments. In short, that means the secrets of the universe, the nature of the operation of the cosmos, will require some assembly. So the second, yeah. The second and probably more pertinent commonality of within the 2012 milieu of apocalyptic and utopian projections is a certain kind of consideration of the factors underlying the periodization of history. This common notion considers that durations of time have particular inherent characters or influence beyond convenient historical modelling based on, say, technology or culture. So we're not necessarily talking about things like the Bronze Age or the Hellenistic Age. They're saying that such periods were considered within a unifying conceptual framework to offer a view of the fate of the entire cosmos. And this is this idea of aeonic revolutions, the idea of an aeon, or a period of time having an inherent destiny or character to it. This idea is developed further to consider not just the duration of a period, but also the changes in the existence and organisation of humans and the cosmos as a whole that the beginnings and endings of periods mark. In short, this idea might be summed up by considering it an interest not in the periodization of time, but of destiny. The periodization of the Mayan long count calendar is the prime example of this within the myriad 2012 narratives. The year 2012 itself is granted special significance, usually because it marks the end of the 13th Baktun, which is a period of 20 Katun cycles, or roughly 144,000 days, and is therefore thought to be cosmically significant and to signal a fundamental change of some kind. The theories of Jose Arguelles provide a particularly relevant example of this kind of thinking. His idea is of a calendar reform called the Dream Spell calendar, that some of you may be familiar with, which concerns returning to a more fulfilling way of measuring time and implementing a calendrical model that better coordinates humanity's perception and experience, crucially, of time into sympathetic interrelations with the cycles of nature. The exact explanations for how these cycles and changes will occur vary greatly between specific theories, but what I am immediately concerned with addressing is the question, what is it at the root of these notions about the way we count time, and specifically how we break it up into chunks of duration, that somehow reflect our experience of it? The snappy answer seems to be astrology. Human measurement and interpretation of time has been interrelated to the movement of celestial bodies for, shall we say, a fair while. From sundials, solstices and equinoxes, back to simply day and night from the Earth's position relative to the sun. Mapping the movements of stars and planets, particularly their regular orbits, cycles and interrelations of movement, has provided humans throughout history with naturally occurring markers for durations of time. Astrological interpretation of these measurements provided tangible human meaning from observations of nature. Certainly, astrology's metaphysical assumptions, reified symbols, ontological taxonomies, and epistemological systems all played vital roles in the occult philosophy of the early modern period. Most obviously, the unique character of the changing months and seasons over the course of a year was understood in relation to the symbolism attached to the revolving band of constellations of the zodiac, for example, fiery Leo marking the height of summer. However, the complex of astrological symbols for characterising periods of time stretched well beyond annual cycles, and indeed even beyond human lifetimes. The 17th century astrologer and Member of Parliament, Christopher Hayden, noted, for example, that between the regular conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, occurring roughly every 20 years, quote, those planets are moved from their place of their former conjunctions 8 signs, which is remaining in a sign of the same elemental identity, and almost 3 degrees, which excess of 3 degrees is the cause why after 10 conjunctions, which is about 200 years, they pass from one triplicity, which is the 3 signs of the same elemental nature, i.e. Aries, Leo and Sagittarius, they form the fiery triplicity, to another. This meant that one could consider the triplicity cycle of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction as a period of roughly 200 years, being how long it took the conjunction to move from happening in, say, a fiery sign to an earthy sign. Indeed, once the complete cycle or revolution of all the triplicities is finished, but once only 794 equal years, 331 days and 16 hours. Let it never be said that early modern astrologers were not, at least on occasion, precise. The very irregularities that might be thought to demonstrate the universe as messy and unordered, such as this 3-degree excess, as I've mentioned above, in fact only encouraged astrologers to construct longer durations as they extrapolated cycles out of cycles. This is but one example of the way star law could be used to think about deep time. Another is a similar discrepancy of the annual cycle of the zodiac itself, which falls slightly short of the previous starting point each year, meaning that the astrological year will eventually begin in a different sign as the zodiac continues to slip backwards. This is referred to as the precession of the equinoxes. It's a thing that, as far as we can tell, the Babylonians were well aware of. And it forms what gets called a great year, which is a complete cycle of the zodiac back to its original position, and it's generally estimated to occur once about every 36,000 years. Precession is also at the root of the notion of the age of Aquarius, each duration of a particular starting sign, that is, one that begins the annual zodiac cycle, being considered a period of unique characteristics. This transition has commonly been expressed in recent times as some kind of change in consciousness.
What was he talking about?
There will be questions. The notion of a particular character of an age or period is given fascinating expression by an astrological historiography outlined in a publication by one of 17th century England's most famous astrologers, William Lilly. This is the guy who got in a lot of trouble after predicting accurately the Great Fire of London in 1666. This idea, the dissemination of which is attributed to Abbot Johannes Trophimus, who was also very interested in cryptography, is that the world is ruled by a continuous succession of planetary angels, which each lend the periods they reign over the particular characteristics of their planet, to rule according to the influence of this planet. So, writing and commerce were considered to have been invented under the rule of the angel of Mercury, the planet governing such endeavours. When this sequence of governances reached the last planetary ruler, it began again. The relevance of this conception to our consideration of eschatology, that is, the end times, becomes clearer when we recognise that, although time is considered to carry on in an unremarkably linear fashion, experienced events themselves are considered unfolding expressions of these cyclical, underlying planetary influences. History has imparted structural comprehension and significance in the form of these angelic governances. So, it's said that the Saracens fought many battles against the Christians in Asia and Africa, and this is taken to be due to the influence of the angel of Mars. But such considerations are not merely the categorization of particular events. There is a complex zeitgeist, a spirit of the age, whether the civilizing yet lascivious personality of Anael, the angel of Venus, or the noble but litigious attitude of the angel of Jupiter, Zachariel. It's also worth noting here that many of the depictions of the early modern history of man in this astrological historiography are evidenced by literal readings of the Bible. So the Great Deluge is dated to the 1656th year of the world, as evidently it appears by the history of Genesis. Speaking of the primitive and uncouth beginnings of humanity under the angel of Saturn, the text even states, "This need not any manner of proof be needed from me, since it is so manifest out of the text of Genesis." And the point here is that for a very long time the Bible was given as evidence and nothing more was necessary. This sequence of planetary influence, or 7-part process, could be applied to understand any number of phenomena. It's a heptarchic dialectic, if you like, and it can express anything from the functioning and malfunctioning of the human body to the unfolding of history itself. This application should be understood in the context of the magical axiom of reflection, of microcosm and macrocosm, right? The holistic worldview in which not just the planets' movements in the heavens, but their very natures and interrelations were thought to reflect deep truths about how everything actually worked. While specific planetary sequences might vary, say the point at which martial influence might replace mercurial, for instance, the ubiquity of possible application demonstrates a further aspect of this ancient wisdom angle, that such wisdom is universally applicable because it dealt with the fundamental structures that underlie reality and the human experience of it. In this sense, such a planetary historiography is somewhat similar to the use of McKenna's time wave zero graph, not just to predict a specific and fast approaching omega point in the future, but to map and analyse the flow of past events. The time wave graph is posited due to its fractal nature, to be able to map the interplay in novelty and habit across any period of time. So this is the idea that, well, with the fractal, calling it a fractal means that you can consider that you could find the entire history of the Roman Empire played out in the course of your day, and that this would mark exactly the same expansions and contractions in power. Like the sequences of governances of planetary angels, it is by a universally applicable structure mapping the processes of history that we see it unfolding. This astrological history did not rely solely on angelic agency, however. There were other approaches that, accepting the reality of astrological influence as part of the ordinary nature and operation of a magical universe, might be considered forms of a natural philosophy approach to the analysis of human affairs. There's a royalist astrologer, George Wharton, who advanced one such theory, that this might be called a form of astrological sociobiology of history. Wharton declared that God hath set certain intervals and periods of time to all empires, etc., amongst which periods the 500 and 700 year are accounted most fatal. The appeal to God in this case emphasises the natural occurrence of such a phenomenon, rather than any kind of divine outside interference. As Wharton goes on to explain how God set such kind of best before dates for regimes by considering astrological influence on human physiology, he explains the natural reason hereof is, for that in this space of time there elapseth 6 generations of men, which abateth of and more declineth from the simplicity, strength, and fortitude of those men, who at first obtained and preserved the empires. Wharton's very clear on the reason for this weakening over time. The superior natural cause is the motion and influence of the planets and stars. What Wharton was saying was that people literally get weaker and stronger as astrological influences wane and wax, to the extent that they become too weak to properly defend what they have founded from generations born under reinvigorating influences. This natural astrological philosophy approach to politics offered a way of comprehending the flux and flow of history and all things in it. It's worth noting, however, that Wharton did also remark that it is not improbable or strange if I were to say and aver that every empire, kingdom, and republic hath some certain angel or genius particularly appropriated thereunto, as a governor ordained by God. The zeitgeist still haunts this early modern historiography. We've seen how the periodization by astronomical cycles or durations, coupled with investment of astrological meaning, can produce theories appraising the entire span of time, the complete meaning of history, and the totality of existence. Such conceptions might seem harmonious and elegant when viewed from afar, conceptually standing outside of the spans of time and space being analysed. Yet up close, viewed from the vantage of our brief human existences, we know this majestic process is punctuated with developments that are often messy and occasionally violent, at least in their alacrity, if not belligerence. To employ an alchemical analogy, The counterpart of the coagula of bringing together separate periods to consider the whole capital T time is the solve of transition from one period to another, the small endings and beginnings that make up this totality. Which brings us around to the idea of revolution in all its original astrological and eschatological significance. The word revolution clearly begins in the language of the stars, and originally referred to the completion of a celestial cycle of some kind, such as the reappearance of a particular planet, conjunction, or other sky event. It's astrology that underlies a sense of radical change in human events out of this original sense of a winding or turning about, which is the meaning that Cochrum's Dictionary of 1626 affords it. As the ending of an orbit was necessarily also the beginning of a new cycle, and this also meant a new astrological influence upon the world. Endings or completions of a duration were therefore inexorably linked through astronomical observation and astrological interpretation to occurrence of a transformation, new direction or shake-up in the nature, ordering and functioning of human life. Planetary movement also crops up in somewhat less straightforward modern theories. One of the most bizarre strains, or more bizarre strains, of the 2012 related theorising is the notion that the year will mark the appearance of a rogue planet with a millennia-long orbit which will enter the inner solar system and visit some kind of catastrophe upon Earth. The apocalyptic end of this theory has been popularised by Nancy Lyder, who claims to have received psychic warnings from the inhabitants of Zeta Reticuli about an impending planetary collision. That's a collision now rescheduled to 2012 after the Earth spectacularly failed to crash into anything in May 2003, which was her initial predicted collision date. Perhaps, perhaps our ancestors would appreciate how information is still coming from the stars. Interestingly, a utopian form of these Planet X theories can be found in the work of Zecharia Sitchin, who holds that this rogue planet, which he calls Nibiru, will merely pass close to the Earth, which will allow the alien residents on Nibiru to communicate with humanity and initiate some kind of higher global consciousness. And Sitchin's basis for this idea is a radical reinterpretation of ancient Babylonian religious texts, positing ancient astronaut-type notions, holding that the Anunnaki of Sumerian myth were none other than our benevolent alien initiators visiting during Nibiru's last pass. While Sitchin himself has denied that this will occur in exactly 2012, preparing to settle for more distant dates, the influence of these ideas on speculative Planet X theories which do emphasise 2012 once again demonstrates the appeal to and of forms of ancient wisdom. So, I want to move away from this kind of slightly more abstracted history into a slightly more concrete idea. Once we've done talking about, the seas boiling and it all going horribly wrong, most of the 2012 corpus tends to reflect some idea about a kind of spiritual evolution of some kind, either of the individual or of the mass of humans. Once the notion of an intrinsic character, zeitgeist, or even fate of a period of time is established, it seems a small conceptual step to attempt to put periods together, like components of a grand engine of history, to discover fundamental truths about the whole span of time and space. On the occasions people do this, attentions usually gravitate towards 3 points in time's continuum: the beginning, now, and the end. The driving forces and influences underlying reality are woven together, and the eschatology of one sort or another is, understandably, a frequent result. One of the most obvious threads of ideological commonality within the less cataclysmic 2012 narratives is a sense of spiritual evolution, of a new and better ordering of the world becoming slowly manifest. But there is a term for these kinds of theory that posit purposefully underlying mechanisms of history leading up to a perfected state of affairs. They are described by the philosopher of science Karl Popper as historicist. Whether it's called a shifting global consciousness, novelty, or even just interconnectedness, there seems a definite shared historicist conception of time unfolding inexorably towards some favourable outcome in 2012. This Popperian historicism is also a staple, perhaps even essential, component of early modern millenarianism. The term millenarianism does not simply refer to the ascribing of special cosmic significance to the ending of a millennium period, like theories discussed above, although certainly this also occurs. Millenarianism as a term comes from the notion that before the full-blown Christian end of days, Christ would return to earth to usher in 1,000 years of peace under his benevolent rule. Indeed, along with discussing Marxist dialectic materialism's utopian projections about an inevitable communist utopia, another frequent example used to discuss historicism is Christian eschatology. But what did the early modern combinations of periodization, Christianity, eschatology, and historicism actually, look like? Well, in short, they look like a bunch of people pulling out all sorts of crazy stuff from the book of Revelation. I want to share with you just one example. In 1643, astrologer and anti-Irish propagandist John Booker published his The Bloody Almanac, in which he outlined a periodization of the history of Christianity based upon interpretation of symbolism contained within that most infamous of scriptural books, Revelation, which is what I like to think of as the psychedelic dessert at the end of the Bible's many-course food for thought. Booker starts this historiography with interpretation of the 7 seals mentioned in the 6th chapter of Revelation as, "You shall find the effect of every seal to be performed within the 7 years of that seal, and so the harmony to be perfect betwixt those seals and the just history." Beginning with Christ's baptism, about the beginning of his 30th year, Booker charts the early history of Christianity by these 7 durations of 7 years apiece, finding specific events to relate to the prophetic text. The 3rd seal, for example, which in the scripture marks the coming forth of famine upon a black horse, is related to a famine occurring between 43 and 50 Common Era, the 3rd of these 7-year cycles. Booker then turns his attention to Revelation's 8th chapter, deciphering the 7 trumpets of the 7 angels as representing periods of 245 years apiece, and declaring, "I am the more confirmed to believe that they do so, for I find in histories that great mutations of empires followed at the end of these 245 years, one after another." Beginning in 71 Common Era, with the start of the final seal, Booker cites in support of this interpretation the destruction of Jerusalem, the transference of the imperial seat from Rome to Constantinople in 316, the burning of Rome by the Goths in 561, the extension of Charlemagne's empire in 806, the beginning of Zedek's dominion of the Turks in 1051, the rise of the Ottoman Empire in 1296, an apparent typo rendering this 1246, but I can't take it up with him, he's completely dead. And finally, the English separation from Rome, or in Booker's words, "our true profession against the kingdom of the Antichrist," by 1541. These events are cited as proof of the veracity of the Bible, the righteousness of God, and, most importantly for eschatological analysis, the accuracy of a prognostication of apocalypse based on such an interpretation's periodization. Speaking of these trumpet periods, Booker states, "I do conceive them to signify the 7 ages that will come to the world's end." The 7th trumpet period would come to a close in 1786. However, Booker, also eager to cite Matthew 24:22, which, as we all know, "For the elect's sake those days shall be shortened," engages in further periodization, again deriving from Revelation symbolism, in order to reconcile this further biblical truth. The 3 thundering angels of the 14th chapter are afforded a 49-year jubilee period each, starting at the beginning of the final trumpet period in 1541. Given that the 4 angels that follow these thundering ones were thought all at once completeth the day of judgment, it was Booker's final considered opinion that the eventual judgment day would in fact occur in 1688, adding that such a projection was plainly proved by Scripture. And so interpretive, not to mention inventive, reading of the Bible teases out of the end teases out the end of everything. Such an eschatological model relies less upon the literal word of prophetic scripture and more on the occulted yet illuminating meanings of the symbols, carefully considered against the events of history, to model an underlying structure of the cosmos. This model of structure needs it, of course, to include the end of things. But what exactly that end was thought to be by early modern thinkers varied at least as much as theories now concerning what will happen in 2012. One set of particularly radical models for Judgment Day was that of the Ranters, who were some of my favourite 17th century radicals, who exclaimed in a multitude of voices about the kingdom of God realised on earth, about a profound shift in the spiritual consciousness of humanity, very like the less defined but no less historicist conceptions of the 2012 milieu about dawning of a new, more positive aeon, paradigm or zeitgeist. The people referred to, for convenience sake, as the Ranters are this milieu of preachers, ecstatics, prophets and rabble-rousers who expounded a seething heterodoxy of ideas, commonly consisting of lay spirituality, egalitarian communality and radical social activism. They had no formal unifying dogma or doctrine, the vast majority of them preaching shades of some form of Christian anarchism. They preached that there was no authority but that of God, and that divine revelation was to be sought without the spiritual middlemen of the church or haughtiness of politicians. For this reason, it becomes understandably problematic, for historians anyway, to consider a particular ranter philosophy or even ranter leaders. A ranter was someone involved in the rant, an anti-authoritarian, anti-formalist spiritual movement rejoicing in personal revelation and social radicalism, not a person who followed a leader, paid a subscription fee, or held a membership card. Nevertheless, one of the rant's characterizations of their fellowship was that they acted, quote, in singleness of heart. Many, but certainly not all of those involved in the rant, espoused millenarianisms often bound up in their political and social activism. One of the most famous ranters, Abiezer Kopp's vision of the coming apocalypse, was one of the return of the eternal God who had universal love, who would fill the earth with universal love, peace, and perfect freedom, which can never be by mere human sword or strength accomplished. The God of the rant, described as that mighty leveller, would bring into check the hubris of government which dared to judge other fellow creatures. This undermining of the authority of rulership can be seen clearly in another ranter, Robert Norwood's question aimed at the ruling elites. Whence and from what and from whom do yourselves hold and derive your rights, power and authority? In, from and by the law, or in, from and by the sword? At the imminent return of the egalitarian God, all would bow down to equality or free community, that no more of your blood be spilt, that pride, arrogance, covetousness, malice, hypocrisy, self-seeking, etc. may live no longer. Human violence would never achieve their utopia, only perpetuate the appalling status quo of men and women establishing authority over others by force, the very thing they sought to replace. The new age of the ranters would instead manifest from the realization of our true and loving nature, a realization that would illuminate every soul at the natural and inexorable dawning of God's return. As Kopp put it, this levelling to your torment, O mighty man, shall up, not by sword, not by might, etc., but by my spirit, saith the Lord. This apocalyptic early modern paradigm shift would indeed be cataclysmic, but only for the old orders built on domination. The new age of spirit would be a glorious one of love, peace, and harmony. It's somewhat difficult to talk about the less formalised ideas of the 2012 corpus, that is, historicist conceptions of a more compassionate or spiritual zeitgeist, that are not necessarily reliant on numerology or calendar law, without straying too far into the territory of the larger category of modern apocalypse theories in general. There is, however, a particular idea that bears enough relevance to both the millenarianisms of the rant and Terence McKenna's 2012-centred teleology. In Richard Linklater's 2001 film, Waking Life, chemistry professor Dr. Eamon Healy expounds an idea of evolution not completely dissimilar to the novelty attractor of the omega point that punctuates the end of McKenna's time wave fractal. If you look at the timescales that are involved here, he said, 2 billion years for life, 6 billion years for the hominid, 100,000 years for mankind as we know it, you're beginning to see the telescoping nature of the evolutionary paradigm. And then when you get to agricultural, when you get to the scientific revolution and industrial revolution, you're looking at 10,000 years, 400 years, 150 years. You're seeing a further telescoping of this evolutionary time. What that means is that as we go through the new evolution, it's going to telescope to the point that we should be able to see it manifest itself within our lifetime, within this generation. Healy's elucidation is very similar to ideas of technological singularity or information doubling theories, which posit an acceleration of information and even intelligence. However, Healy posits more that simply an increase in novelty. He suggests that this evolution we can see in our lifetimes as evolution now becomes an individually centred process, comes from the combination of artificial intelligence and molecular biology, especially cloning, through neurobiology, and would change the very way we evolved on a tangible, social, and even moral scale. I'm not going to attempt his accent. He says, the old evolution is cold, it's sterile, it's efficient, okay? And as its manifestation of those social adaptations, we're talking about parasitism, dominance, morality, okay? War, predation. These would be subject to de-emphasis. These would be subject to de-evolution. Social justice and the freedom of each individual to pursue personal evolution are central to new eons presented by both the Rant in 1650 and Healy in 2001. One couches a future universal change as mystical, apocalyptic faith in a divine spirit to move us in the right direction. The other phrases it in terms of evolutionary science. And yet, they share a profound sense of historicist optimism about the future of humanity, which is clear from Healy's conclusion, which is what I'll end this side of the thing on. I'll have a beer and a bit of a calm down. Healy says, the new evolutionary paradigm will give us human traits of truth, of loyalty, of justice, of freedom. These will be the manifestations of the new evolution. And this is what we would hope to see from it. That would be nice. Hello. Yeah, last section is not very long at all. One of the things I really like about Truthjuice is just the kind of getting together people who are already full of interesting ideas and have heard fascinating things themselves. So what I'm really looking forward to is the kind of forum afterwards where we can swap craziest apocalypse scenarios and that kind of thing. I ended talking about Dr. Raymond Healy's ideas about a new human evolution. And so, inevitably, he says, the idea of human evolution as a whole will come down to individuals. And so this final section is on the idea of a specific kind of meaning for activism, which is one that Karl Popper gives when he's talking about those ideas, historicist ideas he calls them, that posit that they understand how history works and what it's leading to. So we come to the effect of the new eon upon the individual, and vice versa, the role or position of each person within this wider cosmic context, which returns us to considering historicism. There are, in Karl Popper's assessment, two main identifying ideological features of a historicist idea. The first is the principle of the underlying and deliberate pattern of history's development towards a particular goal, discussed before. The second feature is what Popper calls activism, the notion that, although there is some form of predetermination going on in the unfolding of events, individual human beings still have a free will to affect outcomes. As Nicholas Campion explains in his work on astrology and millenarianism, The Great Year, for historicist activists, the only free choice to be made in relation to history is to help it on its way and serve the greater purpose. Each millenarian movement requires a different commitment from its followers. In other words, historicism poses both a utopia to come, while also emphasising important work to be getting on with until it gets here. With particular regard to the 2012 milieu, this type of work has been described as various attempts to, quote, foster countercultural sympathies and eventually socio-political and spiritual activism. There's a keen sense of activism in the informal millenarianisms of the rant around the Civil War period and afterwards into the English Revolution in the 17th century, and with other 17th century radicals, accompanying notions of God's imminent great levelling. One notion Abiza Kopp often repeats is that he himself has been set as a sign to warn the rich and comfort the poor, and also makes several references to holy instructions to write and publish the experiences and messages he received directly from these accounts that he gives of what sound a lot like a nervous breakdown, to be honest, but that, as often, messages from direct transmissions from the divine pen to. Other radicals took their prophetic status further. John Robbins, whose profession is listed, this is brilliant, his profession is listed in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography as, quote, supposed reincarnation of Christ. John Robbins declared himself come to redeem the world to its true condition as it was before the fall of Adam. A fellow radical and associate of this divine emissary described himself as the Melchizedek sent and set by God. It should not be forgotten or underestimated that the activism of the Rant also had a deep thread of what has actually been described by one historian as prankishness, which I really love as a term. Many Rant activists would deliberately court controversy or attack attention in a variety of clownish and socially disruptive manners. We see this in Kopp's habit of preaching naked and drunk, in order to emphasise its antinomianism. That's the notion that antinomianism is the idea that there's no such thing as sin anymore, that Christ has died for our sins and thus revoked Mosaic law, and that we're all now God's perfect children wandering about in a big old playpen.
Do you think you might adopt that style? Do you think you might adopt that style?
I would like to, actually, to be honest. Yeah, I think that would be that. Perhaps not in these conditions exactly.
Cold. Maybe in the summer.
Yeah, I think that's got some mileage. When he was tried for blasphemy, sorry, this is the other point. When he was tried for blasphemy, Abizakop spent the proceedings, quote, throwing nutshells and other things around the room in the church, which is an act worthy of considering in the context of what so-called captain of the Rant, Lawrence Clarkson, described his description of the English justice system as a shell without the kernel. The sign of this dissent was clear. Kopp was saying this court's authority should not be recognised. We should bear in mind Kopp's mission statement that, quote, I will plague your honour, pomp, greatness, superfluity, and confound it with parity, equality, and community. To act crazy or sinfully would confound the great and unheeding and venerate the demonstrable power of a different sort of God, the unadulterated source of authority and judgment, who didn't need the earthly line managers of divinely appointed kings, whose service is perfect freedom and pure libertinism. Kopp's texts often refer to confounding these figures of illegitimate authority and give a sense of their protests being about causing confusion, merriment, and drunkenness. And this appears to be a common theme of ranting activism. Another ranter, Andrew Wick, is documented as causing disruption by kissing soldiers, protesting by being affectionate and perhaps even sexual. His reasoning for this act is a fascinating insight into the kind of merging of the holy and the taboo that appears common in the ranting milieu. He claimed he was breathing the spirit of Christ into them, into these presumably slightly confused military men. This sensual mysticism is just one version of the many millenarian ideas of the Rant about the coming age of spirit. Others might include these antinomian notions emphasising the revocation of Mosaic law by Christ's death, and thereby ushering in a new age of grace, since all are saved by his cross, his wounds and blood. Beyond prophethood and prankishness, the activism of the Rant was also characterised by protest motivated by a deep, abiding sense of social justice, summed up in clamour for the poor to be clothed and given bread. Radicals such as Kopp espoused unity. Their espousing of unity should also be seen in this context as demonstrating their identification with the poverty-stricken. The crying out for bread, bread for the Lord's sake, quote, for the hungry has both immediate socio-economic and spiritual or symbolic meaning. The food riots in 1647 had illustrated both a vast inequality of wealth and an inability or even unwillingness by the powerful to help less fortunate men and women. Furthermore, bread, and specifically the breaking of it, had an important Christian symbolism for these 17th century activists of the Rant, which was utilised to explain their egalitarian communality. Quote, the true baking of bread is from house to house, neighbours saying, if I have any bread, it's thine, I will not call it mine own, it's common. This is the true breaking of bread. This sentiment is echoed by one of the most fascinating radicals associated with the Rant, the man originally baptised Thomas Totney, but who came to be known as the prophet and visionary Theora John Taney, which is how he would generally sign his documents. Documents that included things like claiming the throne of, claiming to be the true pope, claiming to be the king of France, a variety of other things, claiming that he could translate Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, despite being completely illiterate, because God would tell him what it meant. And the way you could be sure of this, as distinct from the lying learning of the academies and of the forces of the devil and the elite, its 17th century Illuminati, was that he was too ignorant to know any better. Taney's philosophy and activism found expression in, amongst other things, a radical rejection of the exclusivity of, quote, lying learning, demands for social justice, and a vehement anti-clericalism. Quote, he said, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, oppress none, set free then bound them, and if this be not, all your religion is a lie, a vanity, a cheat, deceiving and deceived. The main activism of these kinds of radicals was to ready people for the new age, to console the mistreated and overlooked of society, and to pass on an ultimatum from their deity to the wealthy and an arrogant elites. Quote, deliver my money to poor cripples, lassers, yea to rogues, thieves, whores and cutpurses, who are flesh of thy flesh, and every whit as good as thyself in mine eyes. End quote. This mighty leveller would kick 7 kinds of penance out of these elites. Or, as one of the gods of the rant puts it, bow down, you sturdy oaks and tall cedars, bow, or by myself I'll break you. By making these claims, these radicals might even be seen to be speeding up the very process they deemed inevitable, to be attempting to immanentize the eschaton through the very promise or threat of its imminence, which is, of course, classicist historicism, saying this is how things are working, this is how I'm doing something about it, and this is the notion of trying to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. With regard to modern 2012 narratives, there are several strands of activism. Most boil down within the alembic of analysis to versions of raising awareness of some kind, i.e. telling people about your theory or book. A pertinent example of this is former professional football player and television presenter David Icke. Bless him. My mate has a brilliant line in the poem where he says, there is a pub where David Icke hosts pub quizzes. The only problem is all the answers are lizards. Icke seems convinced that the best way to combat the secret aristocratic elite of shape-shifting reptilian overlords he believes have infiltrated every government of the world is to tell people through his books, tours and website about their plans. Quote, with fear as the reptilian's greatest weapon, the plan is to engineer events, real and staged, that will create enormous fear in the countdown years to 2012. Being correctly informed becomes, understandably, the most effective opposition to these sinister machinations. There are examples of millenarian 2012 activisms that do more than promote their particular theory. Proponents of Arguello's ideas concerning the nature of time and how to map it in his calendars have not only set up a magazine, Second Creation, which defines itself as, quote, a voice for the emerging new sphere, in brackets planetary consciousness, end brackets, in the years leading up to and beyond December 21st, 2012. They've also engaged in forming in actual calendar reform movement, demanding Arguello's dream spell calendar, which consists of 13 lunar months of 28 days apiece, supported by a number of extra sort of lunar days. And they're campaigning to make this the standard global calendrical system for measuring time. Significantly, this idea of the dream spell calendar actually embraces the notion that how we measure time affects how we experience it. To advocates of this particular 2012 narrative, only the improved relationship with how we measure and perceive time offered by the dream spell calendar can hope to right the corrupt nature of the Western society that they're trying to save. So we have this idea that it's the tipping point, that beyond that we're screwed unless we get our act together. I'd like to offer one final example of the form of historicist activism for the 2012 milieu. One that in fact ties together the various strands of the diverse 2012 corpus that this talk's attempted to sort of trace. In 2004, Daniel Pinchbeck, who is an author on shamanism and entheogens, posted an account on his website forum of a transmission he'd received a year earlier while taking part in a Santo Daime religious ceremony involving an ayahuasca preparation. This transmission came from an entity calling itself Quetzalcoatl, which is the feathered serpent deity of the Mayans, and gave warning of a coming global change. This transmission is pertinent to this study for several reasons. Firstly, Pinchbeck's transmission makes every effort to combine a wide variety of world philosophies, syncretizing and indeed specifically name-checking Mayan theology, Buddhism, Kabbalah, Arthurian legend, Tibetan tradition, Islam and Christianity, as well as Hindu, Shakti and Gnostic Sophia veneration, and he even manages to work in 666, perhaps one of the most enduring symbols of the Revelation. Significantly, these ideas aren't mashed together to create that sort of undifferentiated ancient wisdom I was talking about before, but are referenced as a compilation of myriad ways different cultures have viewed the same cosmos and the same events. The transmission makes it abundantly clear that we are currently at the end of a duration, that we are living in, quote, these last clock ticks of this world age. In fact, the first words of the transmission from Quetzalcoatl are, I am an avatar and messenger sent at the end of a kalpa, a world age, to bring a new dispensation for humanity, a new covenant, and a new consciousness. It's a prophecy of an old order's end and a new one's beginning. This new consciousness, crucially, is one of Christ consciousness, a notion central to Santa Daime, which Pinchbeck describes as the second coming of Christ, not as an individual redeemer, but as a movement to a new level of consciousness, a heart-centered and compassionate way of being in the world. This idea should, by this point, be looking very familiar to us. Finally, the transmission contains clear socio-political prophecy. Quote, the global capitalist system that is currently devouring your planetary resources will soon self-destruct. And a strong instruction, quote, you have just a few years yet remaining to prepare. In 2006, Pinchbeck had integrated this transmission into a body of theories and activism that made up his book, 2012, the written quite sort of code. So, as a brief conclusion, it actually still remains to be seen whether the 2012 corpus will yield up anything close to the disruptive activism of mid-17th century England, when groups such as the Fifth Monarchy Men even extended to threats of bloody political and military coup. And these are things that happen very quickly as well, without trying to sound alarmist. We still feel, that this isn't a done deal in terms of how people will react to this thing. We should bear in mind the millenarian ideas of most 17th century radicals were not distant projections, but immediate calls to arms. The time wave fractal definitely got something right if we interpret it as demonstrating that it is in the nature of millenarian theories to intensify exponentially as we come closer to the specified date of climax. It's not merely for reasons of rhetoric or advertising that Lawrence Clarkson's book, A Single Eye, declared in its very year of publication, 1650, calling it the year that the powers of heaven and earth was, is, and shall be shaken, yea, damned, till they be no more forever. We will not know the full diversity of activisms associated with the corpus of 2012 narratives for a few more years. It's deeply erroneous to consider that the millenarian lead up to 2012 is unmatched throughout the history of ideas. That is my key point. The point of this article has been to demonstrate the diversity of ideas that a wide variety of thinkers concocted during the tumultuous period of 17th century England. What can certainly be said of now is that we live in a time where there are promulgations of ideas that are not wholly new, but still unique. These recombinations and fresh syntheses of old considerations of history, time, meaning, and destiny make it undoubtedly an exciting point to be alive and thinking about our relation to time and the cosmos as a whole. Whether the impending apocalypse is one of brimstone and cataclysm or love and spirituality, I would humbly suggest we consider that there is a kind of placebo effect to be considered from hope for better tomorrows, that our beliefs and stories about time and destiny do actually shape our experience of time itself. As a tiny example of this, the continuing accuracy of a prediction made in 1965, which has come to be known as Moore's Law, about the rate at which processing power of computer circuits increases, has proved so dependable. Computer companies have for some time been making financial plans upon it, successful plans, which demonstrates the self-fulfilling character our predictions can sometimes take on. Let us also not forget that we live at a time when it is actually possible, through the never-before-seen power of modern technology, for humans both to utterly destroy ourselves, along with the myriad forms of life with whom we share our planet, and to communicate at unprecedented speeds across vast distances. For these reasons, I believe it's vitally important for us to infuse our lives with hope for the future. Not a pallid hope, but veneers apathy and shrugs off blame for our children's future into the cogs of some incomprehensible machine or destiny. But a vivid, a sanguine hope that inspires action and responsibility, genuinely nourishes and encourages the dynamic human spirit of compassion and curiosity. That would be nice.